Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. It's a really exciting time with Governor Bush here leading the charge, and so many education leaders, not only across Florida, but more importantly across our nation. And we're really excited about the challenges we face because it means more innovations will rightfully come from this. I'm honored to introduce a distinguished panel for us today, sharing about how in these very challenging times, leaders are finding ways to do more with less. We have some incredibly difficult choices ahead of us as a state and as a nation. And it's great to have these leaders before us today who are offering those suggestions about making sure that every student has the opportunity for success. In my world, as a college teacher myself, the ultimate civil right in my mind is a great education. And in these challenging times, more than ever, as we face challenges from abroad, we need to make sure that our students are blessed with those same opportunities. And so it's my pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel for us today. First, our moderator. Rick Hess is a resident scholar and direction of education policies at the American Enterprise Institute. Rick Hess is the person who is, in addition to being the Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, Dr. Hess is best known for his work on K-12 and higher education issues. He has taught or is on the faculty at the University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Harvard University, and Rice University. Also joining us today is Tony Alpert. Tony currently serves as Director of Assessment and Accountability for Oregon and oversees his online computer adaptive test used for state and federal accountability. He has been engaged as Oregon's Assessment Director for over 4 years and has evaluated school effectiveness in various roles within the Oregon Department of Education for over 10 years. William Eggers. William is an author, columnist, and global director of Deloitte Research. He is the leading authority on government reform, and as a global director for Deloitte Research, he is responsible for research and thought leadership for Deloitte's public sector industry practice. His books include If We Can Put a Man on the Moon, Getting Big Things, Government 2.0, Governing by Network, and the Public Innovators Playbook. A former manager of the Texas Performance Review, he has been advising governments around the world. His commentary has appeared in dozens of major media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and the Chicago Tribune. And finally, we have two more folks, Kil Ha. And Kil is the Director of Research at the Pew Center for the States. He manages state fiscal research agenda in the Pew Center for State Research and Information Unit. And he is the leading center's new project on state fiscal health. He has overseen project research, policy analysis, journalists, and consultants for the 50 states. And finally, of course, Governor Bob Wise. Bob is the president of the Alliance for Excellent Education and former governor of the state of West Virginia. He is the author of the book Raising the Grade, How High School Reform Can Save Our Youth and Our Nation, and the chair of the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards. Under Governor Wise's leadership in West Virginia, the Alliance continues to build its reputation as a respected authority in high school policy by advocating for reform in America's secondary education system and working to ensure that all students graduate from high school prepared for college. And so with this, I'll turn it over to our moderator today, Rick Hess. Rick.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be up here with a terrific panel. I was asked just to say a few words to set the context for this conversation about how do we think about innovation as an opportunity not just to do better, but really to get more bang for the buck. And I think, to ask the question is to answer it. If you think back on generations of school reform in this country, we have never actually taken notions like productivity or cost effectiveness seriously. From 1933 to 2008, 75 years, we raised the amount we spent per pupil every single year. Right? For 3 generations, we've grown up with a notion of schooling which presumes that we are going to spend more money each year than we did the year before. We've all seen the graphs. If you go back to the 60s, you see that we've increased after inflation spending per pupil by, threefold. Yet if you look at the long-term NAEP scores going back to the early 70s, you're basically flatlining. If this were any responsible business, you'd probably be telling your broker to sell. We don't have that kind of discipline in education. And in fact, even as we think about the reform push post-Nation at Risk for the last 25 years, the number of times that we've heard reformers, these same reformers who were lambasted for being cold-hearted and too business-minded, the number of times we've heard them talk about concepts like productivity or cost-effectiveness is remarkably few. What we have talked about is the need to have all kids do better. We've talked about the need to close achievement gaps. We've talked about the need to customize. But we have had these conversations, for the most part, either without much acknowledgement that there's real costs involved, or with little attention to how do we actually get more bang for each dollar we're spending. The result has been a culture of this and that. When we do merit pay, we layer it atop the existing step and lane pay systems. Thus, the notion that merit pay has got to be expensive because we have to presume that all of our current outlays are baked in, and then we need enough new money to buy off the union so that we can get them to allow us to give additional dollars to the most effective teachers. When we talk about charter schooling, even if charter schools, rocket ship academies, for instance, find a way to use new staffing models or technologies to be more cost effective, that's not part of the appeal. They're not allowed to actually offer parents rebates or discounts, even if they find a cost-effective model. It's not the way we do business. The way that we have had our reform conversations has been one in which notions of performance are almost entirely divorced from questions of cost-effective performance. Fortunately, in every gray cloud, there's a silver lining. And one of the consequences of the last 24 months is we've seen an opportunity to start thinking more seriously and more maturely about the challenges we face. 2 weeks ago, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan came over to AEI and gave a speech that I've been waiting decades to hear a Secretary of Education give, in which he said, look, tough times ought not be a spinach eating exercise. It's an opportunity to think creatively, to use necessity to force us to think more creatively. Necessity, as the panel title says, as the mother of innovation. Just last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I guess, Bill Gates gave a terrific address to the CCSSO when he made many of the same points. We have folks at this conference like Marguerite Rosa, Mike Casserly, the Council of Great City Schools, who are thinking creatively, just like these panelists up here, about how do we figure out how to start spending money in ways that are not just doing good, but they're actually smarter and more cost-effective. And at the end of the day, there's going to be two opportunities. One is to optimize what we're doing, figure out how do we make sure that the programs we're relying upon are more cost-effective. How do we use the Council of Great City School metrics to identify opportunities for more efficiency? And second, how do we use tools, technology, a changed labor market, new opportunities in staffing, to fundamentally rethink the cost structure of schooling? Fortunately, we've got with us today 4 folks who are going to be able to speak about the various dimensions of this challenge. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. Thank you much.
Thank you for this opportunity to come and speak with you about Oregon's assessment system. We've been asked to keep our initial remarks brief and to allow a lot of time for questions. So I'll try and describe our system in that vein. Oregon started its route towards, I guess, a value-based approach to assessment by beginning computer-based testing early in the game, back in 2001. And it started out as a pilot. About 10 to 15 schools began their investigation into whether or not this would work. And as of today, virtually all of our math, reading, science, and social science assessments, as well as our English language proficiency assessment, are administered online. The forces that allow this change, I think, were manifold. But the two most important were that it was first and foremost voluntary, and districts had to figure out whether or not it would be advantageous for them to be able to use this new system and make the investments necessary to do so. And there were significant opportunities that were afforded when districts chose to use the online system. First, it's adaptive. That is, every student gets a test that's tailored to their own abilities, rather than being presented with a pre-established test that may or may not actually give information about how well the student is doing or how poorly the student is doing. Because it's computer-based, we're able to offer a flexible testing window that allows us to keep the window open from October to mid-May, whereas in many states they need to test in a relatively small window in the early spring in order to get the results back for use and accountability. We're able to, by being able to test late in the year, districts are able to make really good decisions about when kids are ready to test and make sure that the test is meaningful in regard to whether or not students have actually acquired the opportunity to learn prior to being measured. What really makes this the system work, though, is the fact that we're able to give instantaneous results. After the student hits the final button and says that they've completed the test, they're presented with their scale score. That gives them information on how well they've mastered the content as described by the state content standards. Within 15 minutes, that information is available in an online reporting system that not only gives individual student results, but aggregates school results, district results, and statewide results that are available for everyone to see. In that regard, that's an advantage that just can't be had on paper. There really isn't a parallel. Similarly, we're able to offer multiple opportunities. Every student that takes the online test can take the test up to 3 times. And the cost of doing that with paper, with an adaptive assessment, with instant results, it's just impossible even to conceive. So when we're talking about efficiencies and cost savings, what we have to think about not necessarily is how much we're expending, but what we're getting for our expenses. And with Oregon's system, we haven't saved money, but what we've been able to do is we've been able to dramatically increase the value and increase the return on what otherwise would be the same investment. As we're thinking about the future and about how we want to add value to the system, we're thinking about ways that we can do it without increasing costs. Right now, and accounting is more of an art than it is a science, but by some measures, we spend about $5 per test in Oregon, which is relatively small, and it's about $15 per student. What we know, though, is that it's primarily a multiple choice test, although we do have an on-demand writing assessment that's included at grades 4, 7, and 11. But because the tests our math and reading tests are primarily multiple choice, that's limited the authenticity and the level of cognitive complexity. So what we've been able to do by partnering with American Institutes for Research is incorporate constructed responses that are computer scored. So students in Oregon will no longer just be clicking and picking a correct answer. They're going to actually be asked not only to identify a triangle, but actually draw a triangle. And that's a very limited example of what we're able to do with their system. That's included in the adaptive test, it's included in the immediate scoring, and it will dramatically improve the breadth of our assessment. Although those items are relatively cheap to create and score as compared to other systems that we know of that use artificial intelligence, it still is relatively more expensive than writing a traditional multiple choice item. So what we've been able to do to try and contain those costs is collaborate with some key partners. Hawaii, Delaware, and Oregon have engaged in an item sharing agreement, principally focused on these new technology-enhanced constructed response items with a goal of increasing the value for our districts, our schools, and for our students while still keeping costs for the state as low as possible. And very proud of that arrangement and working with our partners, and we're seeing some really great results from being able to work together. Not only are we able to get those items, but we're able to better understand how other states are writing items, and that's going to improve our process as well. We've also been able to control costs to a large extent by partnering with our teachers in Oregon. Oregon teachers write all of our assessment items. They also serve as the raters for our writing assessment, which has been an incredible partnership, and we wouldn't have been able to create the system that we have been able to create without their support. When we're thinking about the future, we're thinking about the next generation of assessment systems and how can we further add value and improve upon what Oregon has already created. And Oregon is a key partner in the collaboration with other states as part of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. We're looking to advance the entire state of measurement to create an assessment that's more authentic and includes more application, including on-demand performance assessments beyond the traditional multiple choice, and increase the cognitive complexity while still maintaining costs through collaboration and economies of scale. It's going to be a challenge. It's a huge scope of work that's never been attempted before, but with our partnerships with our states and the support of the U.S. Department of Education and also the schools and the districts and the teachers, we feel confident that we can be successful.
Good afternoon. Let me presage this talk by, I was just in the session with Tom Vander Ark, Joel Klein, and others on disruption in education, and the kind of disruption that they were talking about, and we also heard about at lunch. I think that is the power to change the whole kind of price-performance trade-off as we think about education. Now, some of that's going to take some time because you essentially need the growth of a private sector and others to come in. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give you 8 ideas that you can do right now that you can start taking costs out immediately as opposed to things that might take a little bit more time. So this is more as you might think about sustaining innovation. So let's start with the most controversial thing I'm going to talk about. And if we can get the slides up, that would be consolidation, school district consolidation. Right now, the leader here is Maine, which a few years ago consolidated from 260 to 80 school districts. They just had an initiative. It went on the ballot to reverse that, and it was actually defeated. Now, there's a few problems with consolidation. You will get the savings out of it mostly, but if you get too big, a number of things can happen. It can actually lower education outcomes. Smaller districts often tend to have better education outcomes than bigger ones. You can get diseconomies of scale. The way the curve works is that you start off with very, very high costs for small districts, and you get a sweet spot of about 5,000 to 7,000 students per district, and then it starts going up again as the districts get too large. And politically, consolidation, as you all know, is very difficult to do. But as the slide shows, a lot of states are looking at this now. I think we're going to continue to see more consolidation over the next few years. The next idea is shared services. Now, shared services kind of give you the best of both worlds, and that's where you're sharing these different services across school districts. Every business in America over the last few years has moved towards a shared services model, where essentially you have certain areas that will focus on human services or elsewhere. The key thing to understand here is that it's very, very, very expensive for the average small school district to provide the full panoply of kind of school support services. In California, they looked at this, and for the 10 smallest school districts, it was 578% higher to provide for all the non-instructional services than it was for the more medium-sized school districts. Now, there's a lot of opportunities for shared services. Most actually services, there's instruction services, but certainly bus, food, and a lot of other services like that. You can both share those services and you can contract them out. A lot of this is happening in school districts across the country right now. It's still not happening enough. And where you don't have this, you're basically leaving on the table anywhere from 10 to 25% cost reductions. So what's the state role in this? Well, in the average state, about 40 to 50% of the school's budget comes from the state. You can use that as leverage. Here, some states have passed a 60% rule, where at least 60% of the money going into the classroom 60% of the education budget has to go into the classroom as a regular rule. That's one option to do it. We're seeing other states that have used grants, financial incentives like holdbacks and kind of competition as a way to incentivize school districts to do this. It can be mandated if you want to do it in technical assistance. But the key thing is it just doesn't make any sense today for the average school districts to be providing all of these services themselves. It's just cost that you don't have the luxury right now to not be taking out. The next one is cloud computing. Now, a lot of you will have no idea what this is, but it's actually a very, very important thing. Now, if you've been on Gmail, if you have a Flickr account, then you've used cloud computing. It's essentially information which is stored centrally on the web, and it's accessible anywhere at any time. Every new business, I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with venture capitalists over the last year, and every new business in Boston or Silicon Valley that's starting up is essentially not providing any of their own hardware, software services. They're accessing all of that over the web through cloud computing, which is allowing them small startups to do very, very big things. And there's really no reason why most school districts shouldn't be accessing cloud computing. And there's a number of providers here today that provide these services, everywhere from hardware to software services to apps. So let's look at a few states that have done some things here. Kentucky has partnered with Microsoft to essentially allow all the faculty and students in the state to access applications on the cloud. They estimate the savings to be $6.5 million. Google has a partnership now with Oregon to do the same thing, again, with some cost savings. We're really in the beginning stages of this. But the key thing to understand is that the average school district will never be able to, it's going to cost a lot more for them to operate their own IT services, and they're never going to be able to keep up with how fast technology is moving themselves. So over time, we'll see most of these services move towards the cloud, both with cost savings, and it will enable, I think, much more rapid kind of technological change in education. Digital textbooks was talked a lot about at lunch and in the session earlier. There's a lot of cost to, obviously, paper textbooks, and just the whole notion of digitizing education, where so many of these different applications and amazing things can be accessed in an open source way for really nothing. You know, we heard at the session earlier for $100, which you can access now, it is really pretty amazing. So we're going to be moving away from a textbook-based model, and there's some serious cost savings to be had here too. Shaving energy costs is another option for you. The state of Pennsylvania, they had 49 of their 501 school districts engaged in a common sense initiative, and they looked at different ways through sharing and through other things they could reduce their energy costs. They got about $14 million worth of cost savings through this. There's a lot of different things you can do here. In terms of school infrastructure, a great idea is using public-private partnerships, and this is where you're tapping underutilized assets that the city, the state, or the school district might have for new buildings. One of the best examples of this was actually right here in Washington, not far from here, with the James Oyster School. A number of years ago, they needed to build a new school. They didn't have necessarily the budget to do so. It was going to cost about $10, $11 million to buy the school, but they had some land right near the National Zoo, 1.67 acres, and instead what they did was they did a trade-off with the developer who was able to essentially, they took the land, cut it in half. The developer was able to build an apartment building, and in exchange, the city got a free school worth $11 million, and you see the James Oyster School. There's a lot of different kind of creative partnerships you can do to actually start financing some infrastructure. The country that's really taken the lead in this, and the number of countries have moved towards public-private partnership models for school infrastructure, such as in Australia, New South Wales, but the country that's done this in the biggest way is the UK. The UK now does essentially builds new schools and refurbishes them radically different than we do it here. And here it's more of a one-off process, which each school district is kind of building new schools, and they're one-off. That's very, very expensive to do. They have local architects doing it. The way that they do it in the UK is they put them into, essentially, they're trying to get economies of scale. So what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to have 15 schools here or 20 schools there, and they'll bundle them together and essentially have a developer build them. And they're saying, we're going to actually not pay necessarily for the buildings, but for the access to those schools. So they're buying them as a service, essentially, and they're paying for it that way over time. A lot of cost savings are possible from doing it that way. Now, most states don't have public-private partnership legislation for schools on their books. I would encourage you to look at Virginia and a few other states that have started to move in that direction. Reducing compensation is another area. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a minute. In Georgia, they found a cost savings of $39 million, essentially, for asking teachers for contributions to the pension system. Vermont has done the same thing for about $15 million in savings. And Indiana, they found, could save $450 million simply by taking teachers and putting them onto the state health insurance program. The last area is performance reviews. Essentially, this is where you have teams of people who might be at the state level who go out there and do performance reviews on school districts. Texas has had the most long-standing one here. They won a Kennedy School Award a number of years ago. Essentially, and they'll have teams of usually 5 or 6 people, sometimes working with the consultant, typically finding anywhere from, for big school districts, $100 to $200 million worth of cost savings simply from adopting better business practices. And, you know, Texas more than pays for their performance review teams many times over through this sort of thing, but it brings a fresh eye to school district operations that typically are not there. New Jersey has a variant of this, and a number of states are looking at it, but I highly encourage this sort of thing because you can essentially, you need someone to be able to take that fresh look at these operations, which oftentimes go overlooked. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Kil Huh. I'm with the Pew Center on the States, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk to you about the fiscal health of our states, which are obviously critical to the well-being of our nation. And I appreciate the chance to talk to you about a specific factor, or one of the major factors driving states' fiscal challenges, and some of the ways that policymakers have addressed some of these tough challenges. I'd like to first tell you a little bit about the Pew Center on the States. I'm just waiting for the slides to load. Anyway, the Pew Center on the States is a division of the Pew Charitable Trust. We identify and advance effective solutions to critical issues facing states. Our goal is to actually help build high-performing states that focus on efficiently and effectively delivering better results, achieving long-term fiscal health, as well as investing in smart programs that deliver the strongest and best returns. Okay. So, onto the retirement benefits that states face. Just to put this in a little bit of context, and I apologize for the quality of the slides. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but since the recession started in December of 2007, states have had to essentially close about $400 billion worth of budget gaps. This year, in fiscal year 2011, they're expected to close anywhere from $70 to $80 billion in additional budget shortfalls. And this is essentially the background in which they're dealing with a huge spending driver and a long-term liability, retirement benefits that comprises both the pensions as well as the retiree health care that states afford their employees and retirees. Altogether, this bill is about $3.3 trillion. And as of fiscal year 2008, and this is by and large June 2008, states only had about $2.3 trillion worth of assets on hand to pay for these long-term liabilities. That amounts to a $1 trillion shortfall. Now, mind you, our estimates are very, very conservative. They use a lot of the same assumptions that the states use in their actuarial models, as well as the fact that we just happened to miss the Wall Street crisis in the fall of 2008. We know that the financial conditions deteriorated very rapidly and very sharply in the last 6 months of 2008. And in 2009, we saw a little bit of an uptick, but states are largely going to be accounting for these investment losses, which averaged about 25% declines for the next 5 or so years. That's just part of the way that they account for these massive losses. And so we know that things are going to get a little bit worse over the long run. When we looked at 2008, the pension picture was still relatively stable, if you will. According to GAO, they set a benchmark of about 80% funded, and states overall were about 84% funded in the end of fiscal year 2008. But what that did was that masked a lot of variation. There were a lot of well-funded plans, but there were also a lot of plans that were well below the 80% threshold. In 2008, 21 plans actually didn't even meet that benchmark. Illinois was probably perhaps the worst funded, and the conditions there continued to deteriorate. In 2010, in order to pay for their annual required contributions, they actually had to float a pension bond, not to pay for their unfunded portion, but just to pay for the bill that was due every year. On the retiree healthcare side, the situation is even more pronounced. Only about 5% of the $587 billion that states had promised their retirees in retirement benefits on the healthcare side had been funded at that time. And 20 states had set aside virtually nothing to pay for these bills. And these are bills that essentially will grow and accumulate over time if states, in fact, do nothing about them. They're on a trajectory of growing enormously, and essentially over the 10-year period that we looked at, pension benefits alone, not retiree health care benefits, but pension benefits alone had grown about 135% in terms of what states needed to pay annually just to pay for those liabilities over the long term. I just wanted to put this slide up here as a matter of context to provide you a little bit of an overview of some of the other spending drivers. As you see here, total spending grew over a 10-year period at about 63%. Education, grew at about that same rate, a little bit lower, but there were other categories, transportation as well as Medicaid, that were huge spending drivers. Education and Medicaid currently comprise about 50% of most state budgets overall, and these are the two biggest categories of spending, but whereas education spending is keeping up with total spending, healthcare spending is increasing rapidly, and if you look at some of the other things like correction spending as well as transportation, just to put it in context, those are the areas that are experiencing tremendous growth, along with retiree healthcare and pension benefits. Again, pension benefits in a similar period of time grew 135%, essentially outpacing all of the other major spending categories. And these are budget numbers directly derived from the states themselves. The reason you don't see pension numbers up here is they're actually off-balance sheet items that appear in financial statements, so that's why I didn't include them in this slide. One of the things that states have done is to account for these, they use actuarial models to sort of account for these liabilities over the long term. And what they've done in most regards is assume an 8% rate of return on these investments. Historically, they've managed to achieve those rates of returns over a 25-year period of time. But in recent years, the market's performed nowhere near 8%, especially with the mix of investments that states have sought after. If you look at some of the states as examples, and a few of my colleagues in the pension research space, including Andrew Biggs at AEI and Josh Barrow, have done some other estimates using different discount rates. You see how drastic the liabilities change over the long term. New York, which was probably the best funded state in all of the out of all of the 50, with an actual surplus at the time, it was actually more than 100% funded. Assuming an 8% rate of return, they were running a surplus. California, which assumes a 7.75% rate of return, had a funding ratio of about 84%. If you look at Illinois, which was at 54% funded, they assumed an 8.5% rate of return, and Arizona's main plan also assumed an 8.5% of return. But if you start to adjust the investment rate assumptions, this is what states are looking at over the long term. New York's liabilities go from a surplus to a shortfall of $2.6 billion. In California, their liabilities grow to about $54 billion. Illinois' $54 billion liability grows to close to $70 billion. And this is just changing the discount rate by 1%. If you tweak it a little bit further and adjust it for 6%, you see that the problem grows even worse still. the liabilities just grow enormously. And this is just a tweak of the assumption, and a very, very important assumption that states make. This has nothing to even do with some of the demographic assumptions that states employ in terms of how long people are going to live, and basically just the age in which they're going to retire and things of that nature. This is just one minor assumption that states make as part of their whole actuarial model, and it has an enormous impact on their liabilities. And these are the things that states are currently confronting right now. So what are states doing to get a handle on some of these costs? Well, it took them a long time to get into this position, and it's going to take them a long time to get out. In 2000, when things were more robust, well, the state coffers were a little bit more flush, and the markets were performing much better. More than half the states were fully funded at the time. By 2006, only 6 states could make that claim. By 2008, only 4 states could make that claim: Wisconsin, Washington, Florida, and New York. And as of 2009, only New York and Wisconsin can make that claim. The 2010 New York financial reports are out. They're no longer fully funded. So we're waiting on Wisconsin, but you get the picture. It's a downward trend. None of these states are on a sustainable path with their pension liabilities. And one of the things that lawmakers have done in 2010 is really figure out how to address those cost concerns, or those growing cost concerns. And what we found as of October 2010, and I apologize again for the quality of the slides, is that 19 states as of October had either reduced benefits or increased employee contributions, or done both. And what we know is that even more legislative activity is taking place. In late October, Governor Schwarzenegger negotiated a contract with the public employees, which essentially increased employee contribution as well as reducing benefits. Essentially, they increased the retirement age from 55 to 60 and also required the employees to contribute more. Most of these changes to the reduction of benefits affect new employees, which is where the majority of states have enacted reforms, along with Georgia, Utah, as well as some other states like Illinois and Missouri. All have raised the retirement age, and as well as increasing employee contributions. But these actions aren't new, and I don't think states are over in terms of, or the reform efforts are over. In the 2010 elections, no less than 6 gubernatorial candidates had actually mentioned the idea of transferring from a defined benefit program to either a hybrid or a defined contribution program straight out for new employees, basically changing the employee-employer relationship for public employees. If you look at this next slide, reforms have been happening for the better part of a decade. You see here that many states have engaged in some form of benefit reduction as well as increasing employee contributions. And as I mentioned, it took states a long time to get into the trouble that they're in. It took them years and years to accumulate that $1 trillion gap, and it's going to take them many years to basically turn the ship around and essentially get them on a more sustainable fiscal path. But small changes can have a tremendous impact over the long run, and that's part of what I'm here to talk to you about today. In Minnesota, 20 years ago, when they basically saw that their retirement plan was on a fiscally unsustainable path, they looked at some of the small changes that they could make. Minnesota, at the time, just raised the retirement age from 65 to 66, and now 70% of all new employees are covered under that one particular policy change. And it's managed to save the state over $650 million in that period of time. Minnesota wasn't done, and in 2010, they actually did something along with 2 other states that many people thought unthinkable, and these are things that are being challenged in court cases. But they essentially adjusted the cost of living increases for new employees, existing employees, as well as existing retirees. And that's the big difference. That's a major shift in terms of dealing with the pension reform landscape. South Dakota, as well as, the other state escapes me at the moment, but South Dakota, Minnesota, and I'll get back to you on the other state. Essentially 3 states engaged in that particular reform, adjusting the cost of living. The other thing that I wanted to say is that one of the things that you saw across the board, and Bill mentioned this as well, is that something even as simple as getting employees to pay for their own retirement was something that is relatively new. Just to hold one state out as an example, Missouri, for the first time, actually required all new employees to basically pay toward their retirement contributions for the first time. They also increased the retirement age from 65 to 67, joining Illinois as having the highest retirement age in the nation. But these are the reforms that we see taking place across the states. And as I mentioned again, states are very much looking for ways to save money. They've identified pensions and retiree health care as two areas in order to basically exact some cost savings. But these reforms are not very easy. A lot of these benefits are protected either under contract or statutory agreements. And what you're going to see, is a wave of reform take place, particularly targeted toward new employees. But you're also going to see, I think, states go after benefits for existing employees as well as some retirees. I think people are watching very closely what happens in the 3 states that I mentioned, where they're going after the cost of living adjustments. One of the things that we tried to do at Pew, just to end, is focus on where states can actually sort of bend the curve in terms of getting them on a path towards fiscal sustainability, as well as areas that they can make better investments. And certainly one of the things that we're focusing on are sort of data-driven policy approaches to improving investments in human capital. One of the areas that we've long had a focus on is in the pre-education field, where research has shown you get a 10-to-1 benefit to cost ratio for your investment, and those are the kind of activities that we're engaged in regularly. And with that, I'll end, and I say thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Wise, President of the Alliance for Excellent Education, and soaring budget or tanking budgets, incredible pension overhangs, soaring costs, what a great time for innovation. How many of you are elected officials, if you'd hold your hand up? This is an amazing time. I also it's a tribute to Governor Bush, because I don't know too many others that could pull as many people from all over, so many elected officials, particularly legislators, from all over the country, as it probably sit in the Florida legislature, to come and talk about change. And so that's what's exciting about this. And that's what's exciting, I think, about the presentations that we've heard. Although I have to say, I realize that I've been out of public life now, public office, 6 years, but I realize that I still have a little bit of instinct in me, because Bill, the very first cut that or a change that you mentioned, consolidating school districts, I felt a slight shiver of political fear go down my spine. So I realize I still have an instinct or two. Anyway, I want to talk very quickly about the innovative moment. And one of these measures, and of course we'll be talking more about it tomorrow, the online learning imperative. And I woke up one night and realized that we can't get there from here. We can't do what we want to do in education doing it the same way. Many of you came to that realization sooner, but mine was around 3 o'clock in the morning. And I identified 3 reasons why. First of all, declining state fiscal revenues, and Dr. Huh, I'm going to just pile on to what you just did. The changing teacher demographics, and finally the pipeline, making sure that we can't, the way we're going, we will not be able to meet the goals that our country has in terms of skill levels, whether they're the president's or the Gates Foundation or Lumina Foundation or any of that have been set. So let's quickly go through each of these challenges to us. You've heard this documented well, but this is the graph I like, or this is the one I use. This is the first, the green lines take you to 2008, and those are a percentage of state budget increases. And so these are all states, cumulative, and so I believe that the top line is around 4 or 5%. So in that year, we saw state revenues actually total increase about 4 or 5%. You can see 2008, it begins to narrow. So now let's look at 2009 and 2010. And that's below the line, and it's beginning to drop. Once again, all state budgets, not just education, all state budgets of all states. Now, what is it that has in it that you won't see in the next 3 years that I'm going to lay out for you? the stimulus package. That has in it $787 billion that went to the states. I governed during the last recession, and we didn't have a stimulus. Get over it, Bob. You have to learn to live with it. But at any rate, so that has a stimulus package in it. And so here are the projections for the next 3 years, and that's without any kind of federal stimulus package, and that's also what states cumulatively are looking at. And obviously, each of your states differs, but as I've walked around and we've talked, it's much the same. Now, if you saw this 3 years, so demand for educational outcomes is up, revenues are tanking. If you'd seen this 3 years ago, what would you have called it? General Motors. Demand for a much greater product and less money to do it with. And so that's fiscal challenge number one. Let's go to mounting teacher shortages. And I understand, and this will be in certain specific areas, but I think it's critical to look at. If you believe that if you come from an older model in which the teacher is the sole repository of content in the classroom, you depend upon the teacher to deliver everything, then I want you to look at this running horizontally, left to right. Left, I believe, is around 1960. That's the number of years of experience that a teacher has. So as you can see, as you get out towards the very right, that's around, I think, 40 years of experience. Going up the axis, the vertical axis, that's the percentage of teachers in that category. So if you look at the first year, that very first bar on your left, that means the first year teacher, there are about 3% of them are in the first year, 4% in the second year, and so on. And so so you can see there's a good bunch of teachers congregated together with a lot of experience in 1987 and 88. And in 1987 and 88, you had the typical teacher had 15 years of experience. This is from NICTAF, an organization that follows this closely. So now let's look at the present. But by 2007, the typical teacher had 1 to 2 years of experience. And so the challenge to us is, yes, we're going to have a lot of highly motivated teachers entering the classroom, but we've got to make sure that the classroom and the content, high-quality content, are married. And that's one of the other reasons that we call it the online learning imperative. Let's quickly move to workforce, the third challenge, workforce needs. Once again, this is a 40-year progression across the bottom, and it's from 1973 to 2018, actually a few more years. This is work done by Tony Carnevale at Georgetown. So I want you to look at this reflects the jobs, the skill level that was required for the economy at the time. How many people had what levels of occupation? So in 1973, the blue line at high school dropouts. So 32% of all jobs in 1973 could and were being performed by high school dropouts. The magenta line are those high school education and below. So we had 73% of all of our jobs 40 years ago were being performed by high school diploma or below. And the economy was rocking. We were doing great. So now let's quickly move through. This next is some college, some post-secondary work, not a 2-year degree. Here comes the 2-year degree. Here comes the 4-year degree. Here comes the graduate degree. See how it shifted 40 years ago, 73% of all jobs, high school and below. In 2007, 60% of current jobs required post-secondary and above high school. Post-secondary and above, and it only goes up. How is your state positioned to meet this need? And this is simply reflecting the status quo, what jobs are projected. If you dream, as we all need to be, of expanding our economy, of growing this pie, then we need to increase that post-secondary achievement even more. So those are the three challenges. But then now let's talk about the consumer, the student. This is what the current delivery model will produce for us. Because every one of you who held up your hand, and so many more across the country, you're going to go into session in January. The governor is going to deliver, and many new governors, their first State of the State message. Many of you will be there for your first State of the State, and you've got a choice. You've just seen these three factors. the budget shortfalls, the teacher demographics, and the pipeline challenge, and now we're confronted with the consumer itself, the student. And what we know is this: make no change, and this is the result. 3 of these kids, these are 9th graders. 3 of them will not finish high school. They'll drop out. And 3 more are going to finish high school. They'll get their diploma, but without the skills necessary to succeed in the economy. So at the end of the day, 4 of the 10 only will have what they need. And that's been the model for about the last 50 years. So that's your choice. So as you move forward into this next session, which I think is going to possibly be one of the most critical at the state level, at the local level, and at the federal level in our country's history, as you move forward, what's the choice? You have a choice of either being boldly innovative or badly irrelevant. It's innovate or stagnate. And so let's go back to our customer, our consumer. For these 4, they've been making it for years. But guess what? Both from a moral standpoint, that every child deserves a quality education, and the economic standpoint, this is no longer an acceptable delivery model. Because that means that 6 kids won't have the opportunities they need, and we saw from the Carnevale chart that they won't have the jobs, but even as significantly, they won't be able to meet the society's needs for each of our states and our nation. And so what do you think they're demanding? This is about being innovative so that all 10 are on that board 4 years later, just as they started in 9th grade. This is the challenge before us: innovate or stagnate. I know why you're here. I know what you want to do, but these are the facts that we have to make sure everybody appreciates. This is the imperative to act and to act now. Thank you.
All right, that's terrific. Thank you so much, Bob.
Question.
And how do we want to proceed? Recommendation? Where do we want to proceed? Okay, terrific. What we'll do is I'm going to give you guys a couple of chances to elaborate a bit. I think it'll work best if you can keep your answers relatively concise. And then we'll take it out to the audience and give folks a chance to ask a couple questions. Tony, quick question. So as we think about this customization, you pointed out that there's no immediate dollar savings, but you get a lot more valuable information from doing it this way. Or do we see districts, can you give us a quick example of a district or a school in your state that is using this information in ways that leads to dramatically better instruction?
Well, it's a little bit difficult because the summative assessment isn't designed to really promote student achievement immediately. But in Oregon's case, we did, in allowing the 3 opportunities to be allocated by the district over the course of an 8-month period, some districts are using it in that manner. So Forest Grove School District in Oregon is an example of using that as part of their 8th grade program evaluation and ensuring that students are prepared for high school, and they have one of the best graduation rates and one of the highest levels of student high school achievement in the state of Oregon.
So if you're a state official and and folks understand the difference between summative and formative assessments, but they're trying to think, all right, how does this investment in summative assessment actually yield better instruction? What's kind of the quick thing folks should keep in mind?
I think the instant results and the iterative feedback that is being able to be provided in support from the summative in support of the formative is helpful. So if used properly, teachers can get a check-in to say, for the students that, for instance, are testing early in October, who probably are doing particularly well, then that should they can use that as part of their validation of their judgment in coordination with other assessments that they're providing as part of their day-to-day instruction. So the value is that the system is flexible enough that districts can use it in a way that they find appropriate, and the state can use it to meet its obligations as well. So it's providing a system that meets as many obligations as possible with creating as little an impact on the school districts as possible, and hopefully add value.
But it's also providing the data that's so critical to a policymaker who will have to make decisions next year about literally billions of dollars of expenditures. And so if you're going to spend $10,000 per child in your state, and then what kind of, are you not going to spend $15 on a check-in that truly gets you the information that you need? Not only helps the teacher in the classroom, but also helps you in the legislative committee room.
Bob, what's an example of how to use that kind of summative information when making policy?
I think the data quality campaign is one of the best examples, and most states have now 8 of the 10 elements that are so critical. Comprehensive longitudinal data system. Florida actually was the leader in doing it, because now what you're able to do is you're able to track students all the way through their career and on, hopefully into higher ed. You're able to see where they fall off track, and now you're able to make the interventions that are necessary. Rick, it's what I call the Walmart test. Walmart can track a shirt all the way from Bentonville to Seattle and tell you exactly where it gets off track if that happens, or so can any of the postal delivery services, and yet we're not able to always track our students, and certainly legislators, policymakers need to be able to have that same data so that they can make the decisions smartly about how to allocate the resources.
Bill, some of what you talked about sounds like it's trying to bring that same kind of attention to operations into schooling and thinking about kind of optimizing how we spend dollars. If you take any state, you pick the state, and we go down your list of 8 possible, short-term kind of address, how much money are we talking? What could a state reasonably expect to realize?
Well, I think when we looked at simply shared services, if that was done in a much more comprehensive way across the United States, we're talking $9 billion worth of savings, just from simply shared services, which should be a no-brainer.
And that's $9 billion in K-12 alone?
Right, $9 billion in K-12. And when you look at higher education, that's actually another great opportunity. The average university essentially operates like a small city. And yet, oftentimes the people who would be running those things come from academia and other things, and they don't necessarily operate all the plant and everything like you might always see a city manager doing. So in the university area, there's tremendous opportunities to save money, and also even look at shared service kind of models even across some of the instructional areas. What we've seen is that, does it really make sense for every one of the colleges you may have, state colleges in an area, to have all sorts of expertise in every foreign language and everything else, or do you want to actually have more centers of excellence? You save money that way. But for the most part, we haven't had that sort of a lens, that kind of business lens on schools.
So if we just to give folks a sense of context, if we guesstimate, if somebody were to do all 8 of the ideas you lay out, are we talking about they could save 5 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar? What are we talking?
Yeah, I would say, certainly between, 10 to 25%.
Okay. Kill, as folks are wrestling with these kinds of questions, obviously, we see Bob's slide showing, between the stimulus running out, between property valuations only starting to really bottom out 2013, 2014, the other gravitational forces that are pulling down revenues. How are states coping with the challenges? Are folks actually starting to get ahead of healthcare and benefit obligations at districts, or are you not seeing evidence that the contracts are starting to address these changed realities?
You're seeing it on a small scale. And, as I said, I think a lot of what's happening now is that the appetite for reform is just beginning. It's just picking up. Again, 2 years ago, you would never have imagined states going after the retirement benefits of current retirees, as they are in South Dakota, Minnesota, and Colorado. That's the last state. And I think that on the healthcare side, states don't have the same constraints that they do on the pension side. They don't have the same contractual or statutory requirements to basically provide those benefits. So, states like New Hampshire are trying to get out of the healthcare business altogether. They're essentially setting up employee accounts that are tax-free. They pay into it, they pool their money together, and then they pay for their health care for their members over the unions do over the long term.
How much of this is something that's the bailiwick of state officials versus the bailiwick of districts and school boards and superintendents?
It's a mixture of both. In our data, we basically looked at state-administered plans, but we capture about 60% of the educational plans that are in existence nationwide. Josh Barrow at the Manhattan Institute did a really good job of estimating like what the full teacher liability may look like, and he'll give you, and that paper that he's done at the Manhattan Institute gives you a sense of what the liabilities look like, both from what the states report themselves using their own assumptions, as well as some adjusted estimates that he makes. But the bill is pretty significant, and I think that part of the challenge is it's really hard to get an idea of what the full picture looks like in terms of the state as well as local and the state and local liabilities together.
If a state official, right, so we've got ERISA, which addresses private pension plans. States obviously aren't subject to ERISA. So if you're a state official and you want to get a clean read on the status of your obligations, where do you look?
Well, you look to the state actuary, if you have one. Or you look to the Treasury Department or the Department of Finance. And there they actually have multiple ways of evaluating their current liabilities and assets. Economists would suggest that you look at the market values of the plans. You look at essentially the assets that you have on hand, not the projected assets that you expect to have in order to calculate your unfunded liability. And that's something that lawmakers should have access to, but often don't. So a lot of times lawmakers are not getting the information that they need in order to make these decisions, and at the same time, just putting out, actuarial estimate after actuarial estimate, I think sometimes confuses the situation.
Okay, all right. With that, why don't we take it out to the crowd? Do we have mics, and do we have mics going around? There we go. Please be kind enough to just identify yourself by name and affiliation.
Thank you. Senator Terry Bonner from Minnesota. I think the panelists have done an excellent job highlighting the opportunities and the costs associated with not doing some of these things. But there's been something that's been missing from today's conversation that I would just like to also include, and that is the importance of early childhood education. And as we look at the costs of educating our at-risk kids and the achievement gap, we know that one of the most important things we can do is get to those kids early. And we haven't yet talked about that and what the payoff could be if we target our dollars towards those kids before they're in our schools and not doing so well.
Bob?
Sure. The data is very clear, the research, that you're absolutely right. You can look at James Heckman, Professor Heckman, Nobel laureate's work all the way through. But it's also clear on this. We can't get off by loving them until they're 8 or until they're in 5th grade. It's a continuum. And so what's critically important is it's like building a house. I'm a klutz as a carpenter, and so you can build my foundation, and you're absolutely right, and you need to start working on that foundation as early as possible. But I'm not going to be able to finish the house all by myself. And so as a child moves from grade school and then moves to the secondary system, what we have to recognize is they're developing at each step of the way. And we're going to need to be smart and strategic about developing strategies so that we, 1, identify their strengths and focus on them, 2, pick up the early warning indicators and intervene right away. And that's not a plea to spend more money necessarily. It's about a reallocation first. Because I learned something when I went from Congress to being governor. I had to do something I'd never done before, and that was actually balance a budget. And so I'm not interested in spending one additional dollar to make a dysfunctional system more expensive. Think about that for a second. I am interested, but so you're absolutely correct, though. It's how do we allocate? It's recognizing that early childhood does have a great payback, but I would also urge you to look at the return on investment from cutting the dropout rates. Once again, it's a continuum, and I would invite you, it's a shameless plug for our website, allianceforexcellentaeducation.org, because thanks to State Farm, we have on our website for 90 metropolitan areas, and after January for every state, we have the return on investment from cutting the dropout rate in half and also increasing your post-secondary rate.
All righty. Yes, sir.
Thank you. In reference to the...
Could you let folks know?
I'm sorry. Gary Stanislawski, I'm state senator in Oklahoma. in reference to the pension system, one of the things that we're looking at, especially for teachers, is shifting from the defined benefit to defined contribution plan. Right now, we're funded at 49% in our teacher retirement system, thanks to 2008. And so I'm curious, are there any states that, when they make that shift, freeze the pension plan, but then on the defined contribution, contract with just simple mutual fund providers in addition to, and also contracting with perhaps insurance companies to provide income benefit guaranteed riders? There are many of those type of riders on products today. I'm just interested to find out, are any states actually pursuing that with guaranteed riders, which would act like a personal pension plan?
That's not something that we've looked into in great detail. There are similar types of programs that are employed at the state level. Nebraska is one of those states that has something very similar to precisely that, except the risk is shifted to the state as opposed to the insurance company. They have a cash balance plan that's, that's often referred to as a hybrid plan. So it operates like a savings plan, like a 401k type of plan, but they're not guaranteed a particular sort of defined benefit for life. They have a floor in terms of what they can earn, so it's a minimum 5% guaranteed year after year, and essentially at the end of the person's sort of career, they then convert the account into an annuity, and then essentially the state pays them out over the life of that particular annuity. And so that's one of the systems that I'm familiar with, but one of the cautions that I would make is lawmakers really think about shifting to either a hybrid or a defined contribution plan. One of the things that they have to keep in mind is that the liability that they've accumulated over time does not go away. The other thing that they have to keep in mind is sometimes if you design a very generous defined contribution program, it can be just as expensive as a defined benefit program. So they really have to weigh those things very carefully.
Yes, ma'am.
Jane Cunningham, I'm a state senator from Missouri. I want to know more about how they consolidated those school districts in Maine. Was it a forced thing? Was it incentive? And you also mentioned the sweet spot in the size of a district is 5,000 to 7,000. Did they try to achieve that? Just let us know how they did it. Thank you.
Yes, actually in Maine it was a mandate, and Maine first started looking at this about 10 years ago, actually, and there's a think tank in the state that did some work. I actually ended up going there and spending a few days at the time. So they did some work and they looked at the optimal size of school districts. They looked at what the cost would be and so forth. And then over time, and then they finally passed a law to do the consolidation. Now, we've looked at consolidation of school districts and of local governments. A couple things to keep in mind is that there's a transition time involved in this. There's a lot of change management issues. You're moving people around, and there's a lot of issues that you have to deal with, and it's not always possible to get all those savings out right away. And so I'd say you have to be very, very careful about this. And as I mentioned, that was put to the voters because there was basically a big anti-consolidation campaign, and I think the final numbers were 55 or 56% voted not to repeal it, but a significant percentage of people did want to see that repealed. Now, the thing about shared services, it's obviously politically easier to do. You're not going to have as much heartburn from doing it, but it's also traditionally more of a voluntary thing. You can provide a whole variety of different incentives and everything, and a lot of states do these, and I've got a study on this that I'm happy to send to anyone. Just come up and give me your card. But very few, we haven't seen any states that have mandated so far a shared service arrangement. It's kind of tricky how to do that. Some of the states that have various mechanisms in place for a while are New York. I think we'll hear Governor Christie talk a little bit about New Jersey tonight. Texas provides a number of their services around these kind of big regional areas. And within a few regions, they do a lot more shared services than other regions. But I'm guessing, I think in the next legislative sessions, we're going to see a much more active movement towards kind of forcing forcing the hand a little bit more of school districts. And I know there's a number of legislators here in the audience, from Minnesota, Terry, and elsewhere, who have worked this issue pretty hard. Pennsylvania did have their Common Sense initiative, where 49 of the 501 school districts ended up participating in their shared services thing. But again, that's a fairly small percentage overall. But I think in the next session we'll see this really gain steam.
Okay, well, I think that's true across the board. As the next session, come January, we're going to see a lot of action in a lot of places. I'd like to thank the panelists for a terrific conversation. I'd like to thank the governor for hosting it.